Welcome to the episode two of the Engineering Manager podcast series that we are doing. And we have with us in the episode two, we have with us in the episode two, Vineet himself. We covered an episode yesterday about how the mindset shift is required and what are the generic things that are needed to be an engineering manager. And essentially, when you're transitioning from an individual contributor role to engineering manager, how that shift happens and what are the different things that happen which are different from you being a developer in a team and someone who's leading a team of people, and how the performances are contributed and collaborated together and create value together as a team. And that's something that you are also taking care of. Today we are going to look at what are the different kind of skills that are needed, what are the different challenges come up with those skills, and how you can nurture those skills. So first of all, I'd also like to mention that these discussions that we do are on personal capacity. These obviously are coming from experiences, but not really reflecting any culture or any specific company's culture. So it's obviously may be applicable in your case or may not be applicable. But the generic things that are going to be covered in these sessions are going to be really helpful to become a better manager or better situations that you can face, and make sure that you are aware of how things work in the different kind of settings. Um, Thank you, Vineet. Thank you for joining us again in this session. And so, how's day been? How's been? I know it's early morning for you as well. So, how's been today for you?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you for having me again. I think yesterday was a lot of fun, so definitely looking forward to this session as well. This weekend is especially a little action-packed. I had like three back-to-back things, like something on Friday, something yesterday, something today as well. Today is actually my daughter's birthday party. So after
Oh,
this thing, like I'll have to rush to make arrangements for that. So still, I mean, looking forward to it, and even looking forward to this discussion. And thank you again for the disclaimer of personal capacity. I would also just like to add little bit more to that, like similar to what you said, like based on experience. And my experience has been mostly in the big tech, right? So, and what startups expect, what mid companies expect, what big tech expects, or even different domains, right? Like what financial companies may expect versus what tech companies may expect could be different. So please don't take this as a like the standard across all the companies. Most of it is equivalent, like the expectations wise or responsibilities wise, but every company or every industry may have its nuances. So make sure that you understand those and take what is applicable to you and then customize to your needs.
definitely. And happy birthday to the little one from our side as well, from the GeeksforGeeks team
Thank you.
and
Thank you.
everyone
Thank you.
watching. So going ahead to the today's discussion, I will start off with the first things first. Like, what are the different skills that you think someone who's actually looking to be an engineering manager, what is it that they need, the general core skills?
Yeah, I think you have to start with the technical skills, right? Like that's what probably differentiates engineering
Mhm.
manager with maybe some other or just people management kind of aspect. So that's given. I don't think there is one particular technical skills as such, depending on whatever your tech stack is or the however your team operates, like whichever technology they use, etc. So tech skills are given. I think we already discussed a couple of reasons yesterday, right? Like you need to earn trust of the team, also need to provide insightful contributions, etc. And sometimes uh, engineering managers are also expected to code depending on the company, especially if you have a super junior team, like you may need to actually pick up some tasks. So don't assume that once you become a manager, you're never going to touch code. Focus will shift, as we discussed yesterday. There's a mind shift, there is a expectation shift, but depending on the situation, depending on the company's requirement, you may still need to be very much hands-on. So technical skills are like baseline. That's a must-have. Other than that, I think something that is usually again not taught in schools is soft skills. Soft skills are hugely important. I think they're important for anybody if you want to succeed in your career. I think just having technical expertise are not enough, but they are even more relevant for engineering managers. And the biggest probably component of soft skills is communication, but it is not only limited to communication, right? You need to also kind of build, you kind of briefly discussed yesterday about empathy, right? Understanding and supporting individual perspective, individual needs. Also emotional intelligence, that is building self-awareness, right? You have to recognize and regulate your emotions based on the situation. Like if you're in a heated argument, like you need to act differently as a manager, and you need to adapt basically based on like what is the right thing to do at that time. in addition to self-awareness, you also need to build social awareness, right? Like different teams, different people in different teams have different kind of mindsets, attitude. You have to understand the team dynamic, and then you have to customize your approach based on, excuse me, with different situations and needs. And you might, again, your team might be different. You might need to interact with other teams, other stakeholders. They might be different, right? So building that awareness is really critical, and I consider that as a part of soft skills itself. Uh, Beyond that, I think communication, we can talk lot about that, but let's maybe keep that for a separate question. Moving on to the core skills again, people management is also very important. It is kind of related to soft skills, but there are differences, right? For example, you can use soft skills to then effectively manage people, but it is beyond soft skills, like specifically performance management, right? Like there's a very nice book called Radical Candor. So if anybody's interested, I would highly recommend that. The core concept is basically you have to be both, like caring and challenging. You cannot only show care and let go of certain things even though they are like clearly not the right thing to do, and you cannot also be only critical, right? You have to have a right balance of that, like offering honest and direct feedback when it is needed, but also while showing that you care about the individual and you're offering the feedback for that person's growth and also in company's interest, right? So how do you do that? Like communication plays a role in that, but it's a skill that you have to develop. And people management is like again the baseline expectation. Like that's why you are a manager, so you have to kind of do that. But how do you do that effectively? It's not like you read a book and you do that. Like you have to actively practice that and you build that muscle over time. Team building is similar, right? It's again, you use communication for effective team building, but even understanding what you need to do to build that productive team, a happy team. I think that is a very important skill that I'll consider under people management. Balance of coaching and mentoring. Like at some time you have to give direct advice. At sometimes you have to probe so that people can start thinking on their own feet. Right? It's not that you have to always give the input. So that's the coaching aspect, and that's the difference between coaching and mentoring. Like you're not directly giving the answers, but you are helping them find the answers themselves. So these, I think, some of the things I'll consider under people management. And lastly, project management. Like I
Hmm.
it again, it depends. Many companies have dedicated project managers, so you may not need to do that, but it's a useful skill to have. Nice to have, I would say. In some companies, maybe must have. Like right now, I don't have a particular project manager that I work with, but in my previous, even within companies, I think different teams may have some dedicated project managers, some may not. So having a good understanding of that definitely helps, because you cannot say that, hey, I've never done this before, right? It is
Hmm.
definitely expected of you. So I would say these four things, like technical skills, soft skills, people management, and project management, are at least core things that everybody should be uh, at least have some kind of expertise on. Maybe not like the best expert in that particular
Hmm.
thing, but something that you know and then continuously kind of grow in.
Yeah. And assuming you're coming in from a developer position, you are going into a manager position. So I believe technical skills would not be something which will be difficult for a person to learn or probably unlearn and relearn. But then there must be different soft skills that you talked about, that these are not taught in schools. So they must be a little challenging. Which of these, I think, what do you find that, it's a steeper learning curve? It's not something that comes naturally to developers, especially. So what do you think that you find that is something which people struggle with?
Yeah, I think as you correctly said, like technical skills, like usually I think we also briefly discussed yesterday, high performers are generally kind of promoted into people management positions. So technical skills are given or they already have that. So I would say there is a little less challenge with that. But more, I think it and it'll also vary from person to person. Different people have different strengths, and they pick up certain things in different ways. So, in my opinion, like out of the four things that we discussed, I think people management is probably the hardest, because the other two things, like in addition to technical, the soft skills part and the project management part, as a developer, also it is really important to have, right? Like if you're
Mhm.
growing from even junior developer to senior developer, you will have to incorporate or you have to learn soft skills to make that transition easier or more successful. And same with project management. Like as you're growing, you might be given the responsibility of the entire project. So even though you may not have a dedicated project manager, or if your manager does not have bandwidth, you may have to do that. So that doesn't mean they're easy, but it is more likely that you have already experienced that or have at least some kind of experience with soft skills and project management. But the people management aspect is very different, right? Unless you are actually managing people, you are probably never going to encounter those situations where you have to manage somebody's performance. Feedback, maybe as a senior developer, you might need to give feedback to a junior developer, but that might be specific to a particular task, right? Not as a holistic an aspect, like either considering the whole project or that person's career trajectory, etc. So that's why I think people management is more difficult, because A, there is no formal training in at least the traditional CS curriculum, and B, even though you have been working as an individual contributor, there are very few chances of you actually doing that to get good feeling of what needs to be done.
Right. And when it comes to leadership in this case, like how is it different from the other type of management, like let's say project management or any product management? How is engineering management different in terms of that?
Yeah, so for engineering managers to definitely have the added responsibility of the technical understanding, technical excellence, right? Building the gap or bridging the gap between the technical teams and the business stakeholders. Like how do you communicate exactly what the stakeholders want to hear? How do you communicate with the people want to hear in technical terms, right? You have to
Hmm.
fine tune that to a little better. You have to have good understanding to even talk to business partners about, okay, what is possible, what is not possible. I think we also kind of briefly discussed that. How do you foster innovation in your team? Like that's not necessarily the project manager or product manager's responsibility. It is the engineering manager's responsibility of what innovative things that you incorporate to either solve the business goals or make your tech stack better or reduce the legacy code base, etc. So that is, in my opinion, I think specific to engineering management. Also, tech keeps evolving, right? Like the project managers and product managers may need to have some understanding to work effectively with the team, but it's more on the engineering manager to be closer to technology, and especially with continuously evolving technology, right? You cannot say that this is what has been all the time and that's going to be in the future as well, right?
Hmm.
So you have to be well equipped to kind of adapt to that change. People management is also on a same aspect. Like again, product managers may have some other product managers reporting to them, but you can be an individual contributor product manager, and same with project manager. You don't have to be a people manager. Whereas in
Hmm.
engineering management, like you have to manage people. Like there is no individual contributor engineering manager, right? Like that just
Hmm.
doesn't make sense. But there could be individual product managers and individual project managers. So that's another difference. And then, excuse me, uh, some project management job roles may require specific certifications. Product managers may require, again, some specific background. Uh, Engineering management, like you don't really need a certification as such. Like you don't need an MBA to become a manager, at least in the
Hmm.
tech industry, right? Hardly anybody I know actually has an MBA, like any managers. Like it's nice to have, but it's not a must have, or even like any project management certification or anything like that. So that could be another thing that is different. You need to have the skills, but certification is not necessary. So I would say like these are some of the things differences that come to my mind between engineering management and the product or project management.
Right. And you also talked about how communication is very important as an engineering manager because it's a whole different, you can spend a whole hour on that. But essentially, I want to make sure like we cover that part wherein what do you consider like an effective communication between the team and the stakeholders? Like you said, these are two different kinds of communication. And of course, they are covering a lot of aspects about how project is being done, how team is growing, and how things are being covered in general in communication. So if you could share some light on that part as well.
Yeah, let me divide it into two parts. One is just in general effective communication, which could be applicable for individual contributors as well, not just managers. And then we will also see like what are some specific things for managers, which are probably less relevant for developers, right? I think whoever is listening, if you could take one thing away from the communication thing, I think it's very simple to remember. Just ABCs of communication, right? A stands for authenticity, B for brevity, and C for clarity, right? You need to make sure that whatever message you're conveying, like you appear, not just appear, but you are like authentic. You are not trying to sugarcoat things. You're not trying to exaggerate things or downplay certain things. Like be authentic in your message. It matters a lot, right? And it matters for both individual contributors and also for managers because it's a way to build trust. Be brief, like brevity is for like being brief. If you elaborate a lot of things, not everybody has time to first of all listen to all that, process that, and then get the gist out of it, right? So in most of the time. Like small talk is different. You can talk whatever you want, but if there is an important message that you need to communicate or convey, I think being brief is really important. And then that it kind of goes with clarity, right? Like you have to be brief, but you have to be clear to so that the other person understands in that shortened form what you're trying to say, right? So I think ABC of this communication, like it's relevant for anybody, and it's even more for managers because they have to kind of tweak that for their audience, right? So tailoring for the audience, like what you talk to your team is different from what you talk to your stakeholders. We will talk about that, but before that, like I'll touch on some other things which are also kind of equally applicable for both. Active listening, we also talked about that yesterday. Like you have to make sure that you're actually listening to what that person is saying before you form your own opinion or rebuttal or whatever, especially when you don't agree on a certain stance, right? Like that's when you are most likely to ignore or like pretend to hear and then still kind of have your own opinion without even understanding the other point of view. Applicable to both developers and managers. Asking questions is an art, right? And for managers, especially because they cannot be extremely kind of in deep with any particular technology thing, but they still need to understand what's going on. Asking questions is really important. There is no stupid question, right? But you try to make sure that you don't ask the same question again and again. Maybe twice is okay if you miss taking notes for the first time. But and asking question is an art. Like you have to not ask for the sake of asking, but actually asking some open-ended question, like preferably not a yes/no answer, okay, depending on the situation. But if you're trying to dig deep and trying to understand either the motivation or thought process behind a certain things, asking open-ended questions help a lot. So these are, I think, some of the things which are relevant for both. Now, coming back to your earlier question about like how does a manager kind of what all things you need to consider while talking to the team versus while talking to the stakeholders, right? So for team, I think details matter a lot, like in even in technical terms or even project task level details. So you need to make sure that you understand the specifics, you understand the details, or you provide specifics, you provide the details. High level, oh, we need to build a UI, like doesn't make much sense, right? Like, what do you mean by that? Like, so you'll have to talk in a lot more details with your team. Whereas stakeholders, that may not matter, right? Like there are some cases where you need to provide details, but not always. Like they're generally like high level overview is what they're looking for, and tech jargon they may or may not even understand what you're talking about. With your team, you have to be direct sometimes. Like if you see that you're going in the wrong direction, you have to be direct. Say, this is not the direction you need to take. This is why we need to go this way. What are the implications, etc. Sometimes directive, but sometimes you also have to wear the coaching hat. Right? So if you see that something is not right, but there is no immediate pressure that needs to be corrected immediately, you may need to take a different approach and ask more questions about why are you doing this? What do you think will happen if you do this? Have you considered this particular case, right? Like how will this work in this particular situation? So you're kind of helping that person understand if they have overlooked something or if they have not taken into something into consideration. So as a manager, you need to juggle between when do you need to give direct instructions on what needs to be done versus where you ask more probing questions and help the team get to the bottom of that. These kind of things may not be needed with the stakeholders. Like you're not really giving them any direct, except for the updates, right? But it's more relevant one for the team. One thing that is common between both is setting clear expectations, but what the expectations will look differently, right? For team, the expectations will be around like what is the time frame that you're expecting this to be done in, what are some considerations, like what is the definition of done, right? Which is really important. Like sometimes different people assume things differently. Whereas with product managers, like expectations will be again around time frame, but more from okay, what we can do rather than telling them that we need to like this needs to be done by this time. And also expectation about capacity, how many people you have, how many things you could do. So managing expectation is really important for both, but they could be slightly different in different ways. One feedback is also more, I would say, important for the team than for these stakeholders. But even sometimes, like you should not feel afraid to give feedback to stakeholders also, or seek feedback from them. What is working in our partnership? What do you think could be done differently? Do you require more frequent updates or less frequent updates? Like, unless you know those details, you won't be able to build like a stronger relationship with them. And same thing with the team, right? Like, what are they doing well? What are they not doing well? What should be done a little differently from individual performance perspective and also from the project perspective? So feedback is also another kind of common thing. One thing that is more relevant for stakeholders or especially for upper management, there is an acronym. I don't know who came up with that, but it's called BLUF, BLUF, bottom line upfront. Right? So not the bluff meaning like, okay, I'm bluffing kind of thing, but as I said before, like not many people will have a lot of time to hear out the entire story, right? So, for example, let's say if you're running late, if you feel that there's a risk of we are not going to meet this milestone, and if you're going to tell that to a product manager, if you start with, hey, we are having this particular thing and it did not go, we were dependent on that team, product manager is wondering what are you expecting me to do, right? Like what is the ask from me? Like are you telling me to talk to the other team, or are you just giving me an update? Instead of that, if you just start with, hey, we are running a risk of missing this milestone, now they are focused. Now they know, okay, tell me more, right? And then you give the details about why, like what is the dependency, is there any dependency or blocked on, or is there a more technical competency, sorry, complexity? But if you start with that, like they won't know where is this going, right? So make sure that you give the bottom line upfront and then kind of hold their attention, and then again follow these like ABCs. Like don't try to make up scenarios, but be authentic in what the challenges you are facing. Be brief, be clear, and that is in my. I mean, it works with the team also, but it is more relevant for stakeholders and upper management, especially because you are not the only person they are working with, right? They have so many other things or other things or other demands on their mind that this bluff thing is usually helps. And talking about dependencies, I think communicating dependencies, again, important in both cases, but maybe a little different form. Like in your team, you have to make sure that people understand what the dependencies are and they work on that, or kind of clarify that ambiguity or de-ambiguate that like as early as possible. Whereas to stakeholders, you need to make sure that they are aware of the dependencies so that they know that you are not the only one who is kind of responsible over this. There could be multiple other teams that either they need to follow up with, or again, risk factors, right? So it's not kind of completely on you. So making sure that you clarify and highlight dependencies, bottlenecks is really important. What else? Am I missing anything? Yeah, probably. I think, yeah, does that answer? I think is this what you're kind of looking for?
Yeah. That's the kind of answer I was actually looking for. And one thing I also want to ask, if there is any difference in the mode of communication that you choose, like written or verbal. How is it like this affects the communication that we are looking for?
Yeah, I think communication is both ways, right? Actually, three ways. Written and verbal are two most common or widely understood things. But there is like non-written, non-verbal
Non-verbal.
communication. Like it's basically how you talk to a person, right? Like that also matters a lot because people derive like either certain emotions based on what they see and what they observe rather than what they hear, right? So if you don't sound excited, but if you say that, oh yeah, we are doing really great, like our project, everything is on fine, like you're not going to trust me, right? You're like you don't sound like that. So these non-verbal cues of how you're like, are you actually looking into their eyes, like are you smiling, like are you having any gestures, or are you just like sitting like this, lack of energy? People sense that a lot, right? So even that is very important. But going back to the other like written and verbal thing, both are extremely important. Both have their place. Written, most importantly, is like specifically for manager. I think they are responsible for writing strategy docs or the plan for whatever the quarterly planning, semi-annually, annual planning, etc. So you have to be like, nobody has time to read like 7 pages, right? So some come like Amazon follows something called one pager. Like you have to condense everything into one pager. If it is practically impossible, like they have 6 pager thing, but that needs to be like real. You really have to have 6 pages. One team does not need 6 pages to explain what they're doing in one quarter, right? So like how do you condense that in one page? Or if you're talking about the whole org, like then maybe how do you still condense that in 6 pages? That's a real skill and it is very difficult to master. And I don't think there is a checkbox that okay, I've arrived kind of thing. It's a continuous learning thing. Another place where written communication is important is writing, say, performance documents, right? Like you telling is one thing. Of course, you need to deliver that also, but you also need to have like written data points of why you are giving this rating to this person, right? Like what projects were done nicely, what could have been done differently. Same thing for promotions, right? Different companies and teams, well, not maybe teams, but different companies will have different process for promotions. At least in Amazon and Google, like it's extremely data driven, and it is in written format. Like it's not that you're
Mm-hmm.
best buddies with your manager, so you'll get promoted. Right? You need to show the data. So from manager perspective, you need to also show like why you want to promote this person, what they have done. These companies also have like role guidelines, what is expected from which level. So you will have to kind of articulate how they have demonstrated the next level capability in which project. So you have to kind of document that in a way that it is easy to read and gives the reader good idea, but the reader also does not have time to go through a design docs of that particular thing of did it exactly meet or not, right? So all these things are super important in terms of documentation. Then providing updates to stakeholders. I personally prefer both. Like you have to tell them in person, and you also have to kind of have a proof of whatever things that you have discussed, either the agreements or changing timelines, right? Like you don't want something to bite you back later saying that, hey, you never told me this, even though you told that person in like verbally, but if you don't have any kind of paper trail, you might get into trouble. That plus leadership sometimes require updates either by email or as a newsletter. Nobody has time to read pages and pages. So how do you kind of give bullet point summary? So very important to kind of understand what details to provide to which reader, what to omit, how much length is appropriate. So like that. And for verbal, same thing, like especially performance thing, it's very hard to give bad news, right? But I think it is more effective to give that in person. Again, for these reasons we described before, you need to have a paper trail, but you need to be able to look into that person's eye and tell them that, okay, this is something that you did great and this is awesome. Keep doing that. That has much more value than sending an email saying that great job. Right? Like if they
Mm-hmm.
see in your like expression that you mean it and you value it, they are gonna value it a lot more. And same thing with constructive feedback, right? Like you need to explain and elaborate. It is not written is usually asynchronous, right? Like you send it
Mm-hmm.
and then they may read and they may reply, and then there's a lot of time that may go in between. Whereas if you're talking to a person, you can get to the bottom of things much more quickly, and you can clarify a lot of things that could have either could be interpreted differently or could appear differently in the written form. So you have to also assess what is the right method of communication for what purpose, and you have to apply that effectively. So that is something that I think the managers kind of have to balance and jello. And lastly, presentation. That is kind of a form of written, but
Mm-hmm.
some like Amazon, like presentations are not really looked like in favor. Like usually they prefer documents, but different companies follow differently. So you may need to also, if your company does like give emphasis on presentations, then you have to make sure that you again provide information succinctly. You don't want to write paragraphs on a slide, right? Like who's going to
Mm-hmm.
read that? So how do you kind of convey the same message in just a few bullet points, but explain that well, etc.
All right. And related to this, one person has asked in the chat is, are there any tools that an engineering manager needs to learn to better utilize their time and, improve their work productivity?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, different people do use different things. I don't think there is a particular thing that
Mm-hmm.
oh no, everybody should go and learn this thing. I mean, for project management, there are tools, but it also depends on what tools your company uses.
Right.
Uh, Productivity wise, like there is literally is totally kind of individual base. So
Yeah, that really
sometimes
depends on the
people just
person.
write. Right. Yeah. I mean, keeping good track of notes, I would say you should do that. Like what tool you use, up to you, right? Some people
Mm-hmm.
just use plain Google Docs. Some people use some fancy app.
Mm-hmm.
But I think keeping notes of lot of things comes in very handy, especially at the end of the year or at the when you're communicating impact of the project, right? Here in evaluations, especially like you're not going to remember who did what in January if you're writing that in
Yeah.
November, right? So keeping a track of highlights, achievements, some of the misses, those are also equally important. So if you have a running list of that, I think that's important. When you have one-on-ones, I would strongly encourage keeping again a track of that so that the person also knows what you have discussed, if there is any feedback that you provided, what they're supposed to work on, rather than just my memory is pretty
I
bad. I
mean,
don't remember what
mhm.
happened last week. Like, so forget about like a month ago. So I think note taking is, I would say, like a bare minimum thing. Like what app you use is it's up to you. For time management, some people use the Pomodoro technique. I've been going back and forth on that. It works for some. It doesn't work for some. You should basically do research and try out certain things. Like there is no one kind of gold standard that I would say that no, everybody kind of needs to do that.
Right. So maybe anything which helps you document things, which can help you present in a way which is again comprehensible and understandable for anyone, then that's a golden tool for you. But it really depends on the person to person, I believe.
Yeah.
One person has asked, like Govind is asking, as an NG manager, do you need to learn new tech in depth at implementation level, or if you need to know the use case of that specific tech and that is good enough?
Depends on your team's composition, expectation from your management, etc. Like for example, if your team is senior enough that they already have a good grasp of that, I don't think you need to understand that to the core details unless you are interested in that. Then sure,
Mhm.
like I'm not going to stop you from learning things, right? Like learning is always good, but if that's not expected, then you may not need to do that. But again, you have to clarify that, not as in they just ask question all the time, but like you need to understand what is their management expecting from you, or even just get a sense of how much actual technical information you need to provide. So if your team is super junior, if you have all the college graduates who have not worked with that technology but with something else, then you will have to play a lot more hands-on role, right? So I think it depends on the situation. There is again no one kind of golden standard as such.
Yeah, I mean, the more you know is better, but again, it is about how much you need to know. That is very important. And that
Yeah.
is obviously you should be learning that much. Um, Sumita asking, is this too soon to switch from developing to managing? I did developing for 2 years, but now have taken a operations management role in another company with lesser pay. Everyone pushes me to go back to developing. So is it too soon or will earn a lot in developing? Like, okay, you can help them understand. It's more a very personal or an individual level question, which really depends on what are your expectations of things from your life. But if you can shed some experience from your side.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it right? Like it's very individual specific. Like there is no rule of thumb. Of course, right after college, nobody's gonna make you a manager. And 2 year does sound little on the lower side, but I personally don't know the operation management's requirements and whatnot. So you could, if you like that role, you could grow into that and then kind of assess what you need to do. As a developer, I would say, yeah, 2 years little on the lower side because it's kind of exposure, right? Like again, understanding expectation. You don't want to set yourself for failure. Uh,
Mhm.
there is no right timeline that okay, 4 years and you're ready, right? But 2 years does sound little on the lower side to say that yes, I want to make transition into management. But you might be a part of startup where there are no managers and you are the most
Mhm.
experienced employee, and you might have potential, right? So who am I to say that no, you had 2 years is too less, right? So I think a lot of things depend on the context. Uh, in big tech, if you have to see, I personally haven't seen anybody transitioning into management just after 2 years. It usually
Mhm.
happens at 4 years or 5 years mark, but that is just what I've observed. Like there is no written rule. A lot of things will kind of depend on the context.
Yeah, I mean, if someone is actually looking to work in a manager role, probably they will have to know a lot of about the skills and the technology probably that they are working on. But then again, it is also about what is it that you really like doing. So at the end of the day, it's your decision to make, but do focus on the things that helps you grow in a career, right? And if you are too soon switching on to a management role, and then you're kind of missing out a lot on the basics front, but you can obviously learn that while being a manager as well. So I would suggest it really is your personal decision, but keep that in mind that you need to keep learning on the things. And we are also discussing about the different kind of skills that you are going to need probably in managing, not exactly in operations management, but in general, the kind of skills that you are going to need are definitely communication skills, documenting stuff, and being able to communicate what are your expectations of things and how you are going to manage a project. These are things which are really common in those things. Um,
Yeah.
One interesting question that has come up is, can you rely on LLMs while documenting, or do you use any of the LLMs to, for just the structure of the document?
Yeah, sorry, I shook my head, but I was thinking about for something else. The answer is yes and no. You can use it for some things, you cannot or should not use it for some other things. Like especially like even at Google, like we have our own LLMs, right? But we
Hmm.
are not. I don't know whether encouraged is the right word or allowed is the right word, but any personal information, right? So we are very discouraged from using that to write promotion documents or year-end evaluation because then you have to input that personal data. I mean, not name like address or that kind of thing,
Hmm.
but even the name and the specific projects and whatnot of that person, right? So that is looked down upon. So I would caution you against using that, especially if you're in a company which does not have its own thing, and if you're relying on somebody else like Gemini or even ChatGPT, you are sending like data to somebody else, right? So you have to be
Hmm.
very careful on what is allowed to send and what is not. If it is a question of formatting an email, and if that email does not contain anything significant that is like proprietary technology or trade secrets and whatnot, sure, I've used it to polish my emails quite a bit. So use your judgment. Make sure that what you're doing when you're using that, like especially around sending data to third party. So be aware of your company's policies and the consequences of those.
Definitely. One question I wanted to touch upon about in general, since we are discussing about skills and how do you, it's again going to be a skill when it comes to management, deciding the timeline. So how do you decide the timelines for a project? Like is there any process that you follow? Is there a way that people should approach this issue?
Yeah, I think like everything else, it will probably depending on the project and context. But general framework, if you have to kind of consider, uh, if it is something that you have done before, then you can use your intuition to understand approximate time frame. That okay, I've done some similar project like that. It took 2 quarters, so maybe we're talking about 2 to 3 quarters. But that's how you start, right? Like that is not the commitment. That is something that you're thinking that okay, this is what approximate that I'm thinking about. You should always involve your team before giving out any commitments, right? So about even specific estimations and whatnot. Uh, when I say team, actually, so some teams have dedicated QA partners, some teams don't. But if you have QA partners, like involving them earlier is very important because they also play a role in estimating how much time they need to come up with either the test automation or test cases and whatnot. Right. So it should be a team effort. It should not be just you saying that, okay, yeah, we are going to do this in 2 quarters, unless you yourself are doing it and you're super confident of that. Right. Then you have to kind of break down the project into milestones, right? Okay, if you have to build this, like what does that mean? It does have UI component, backend component, database components. Then what is parallelizable, what is not parallelizable? So break down those milestones into further tasks, and then depending on whatever processes you follow, either you do a group discussion around if you know who is going to work on those projects or who is needed or is the entire team needed, then taking everybody's opinion on like depending on what process you follow. Right? In Agile, you have the points and then stories and tasks, and then you do sprint planning, etc. So I mean, but that doesn't have to be the standard. But the point is, you break it down to as minute or granular level as possible, and then estimate, roll up, and see approximately what time frame you're looking at. Always add some buffer. Again, there is no golden rule of how much, like twice or 1.5 times, but you have to have buffer because things will go wrong. Like Murphy's law plays a role all the time, and we tend to we are really bad at estimating, right? No matter how much experience you have, like either things will go super fast or things go super late, mostly on the late side. So you have to kind of add buffer. Another thing which is usually new people struggle with is again that definition of done, right? Like code complete is not definition of done. Like it should not be. You have to
Hmm.
consider like first clarify that with product managers, like do they want to use it just for testing in prod or do they want actual people using it in prod, right? So even in prod could mean different things. Like in prod
Hmm.
for internal users to test is very different from in prod for the general availability for other people to use, right? So that, and then are you including like integration testing, load testing, monitoring, deployment, like setting up monitoring and alarming depending on what process you follow. I personally recommend doing that because you don't want to rely on manual thing all the time. So that is super important. Many times, as I mean, even I didn't know because I mean in Bloomberg they didn't follow this particular. They didn't have to. A/B testing is super important, right? Like if you're, especially if your
Hmm.
company is following that, A/B testing requires significant time, right? Like by nature. when things are in prod, you let a particular set of users use your current version and then some other like the newer version, but you need time to analyze the data to understand what's going on. Is this the right thing, or do we need to make some changes? So you cannot expedite that, right? You need at least like a week worth of data, right, depending on what data we are talking about. So you need to know, like, if you're committing something, like if you're saying that I'll make it available for A/B testing, it's one thing. But if you're saying that I will have it general availability, you have to kind of factor in that A/B testing time as well, right? So there are a lot of these things which, for especially for new people, it's not obvious for them. Like, I'll code it, I'll test it, and it'll be deployed to prod tomorrow, right? Like that, it doesn't work that way. Like there are so many things that are missing, and also emphasis on testing. Like I can't emphasize it enough. Of course, there are some times where you'll have to take some shortcuts, but the more automation you have, you're gonna save a lot of trouble down the road, right? So you have to incorporate that also in your estimations. Going back to the QA part, like if you have QA partners, like you should not estimate for them, right? Like they should be the ones who are kind of. It's I have seen this, and it kind of pisses me off right now to see that, okay, devs do everything and then hand off requirement document and the product to the QA saying that now go and test it. You could do that. Why do you need QA to do that? Like, are you just looking for somebody to just perform manual whatever test plans you came up with? Like, why do you need somebody else for that, right? QA should be looked at as people who know how to test things and who need to come up with different test cases, not follow somebody else's plan, right? And then the earlier they are involved, it's better, because then they can think, okay, what are different scenarios, what I need to consider, what are the dependencies I need to test for, does this need security testing, does it not? If you are telling them everything, then you don't need them, then you could do it yourself, right? So try to involve them as early as possible. Again, I know that it's probably idealistic situation and different companies have different processes, but you don't have to always go by status quo. Sometimes you can challenge the status quo and then add these new practices if it makes sense in your case. Then you have to prioritize, right? Like we work with stakeholders or product managers specifically to understand what is the bare minimum, the MVP or the P0s, we call it. What is the bare minimum thing that has to happen? And then what is the P1 thing? What are nice to haves? So that gives you an idea that what has to happen first to meet that, at least the bare minimum expectation, right? If you can't even do that, then it's not good. So, but if you are running against some timeline pressures and whatnot, then you can at least say that, okay, let's do this for the release for the nice to haves, or only focus on P0, P1, or only focus on P0s, etc. But if you don't know that, like discussing that at the time of rollout is not really ideal. Uh, we also talked about dependencies earlier, right? So how do you kind of identify dependencies as early as possible? Especially if they're external teams, like you need to talk to them and get commitment from them before you commit your timelines to the external to your stakeholders, right? If you say that, oh, I'll be done in 2 months, but then if you forget to mention that, oh, but we are dependent on this team and they don't have bandwidth, like what are you going to do, right? So you have to again, like it may not be crystal clear in the beginning, but so there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns, right? So if there are at least known unknowns, you have to take care of that. And if you know that there are definitely certain things that I don't know, like who else is involved or who should be involved, who are we dependent on, you have to make that clear also, saying that, hey, these are certain things we need some more time to figure out before we can commit to that. And in Amazon, I learned this concept. I think it's pretty useful. Is if you're not giving a date, you need to give a date for a date, meaning that, like, I can't tell you right now when we will do this, but I can tell you in 3 weeks I'll have better idea, and maybe in 3 weeks I can tell you when we can do this, right? And obviously, depending on the information you gather or whatever your findings are, you can make again like that for a date for a date. You can't do that indefinitely. Obviously, at some point, people are gonna say, "Come on, man, you have to tell me something." Right, but it is totally okay to give a date for a date and not just kind of make up something and then make people hold you accountable for that, right? Because they're not, it's not their responsibility to ask these questions to see, did you consider this, did you consider that, right? It's you are the owner of the project. So that is really important.
Right.
But
And
yeah, I think
one thing
that's
that,
kind of pretty
yeah,
much.
in this, like you talked about how different teams are involved and how different teams have their own timelines and probably working on different projects as well at the same time. So how do you actually manage those unexpected things, like you talked about unknown unknowns? So how do you manage those things in the project? Of course you keep a buffer, but then how much can you keep? There should be something which is again coming in and then you can't really plan for that. So how do you manage those expectations, or is it something that you have to talk to stakeholders probably? And what is the general guideline on that?
Yeah, I think you have to talk to stakeholders regardless. You have to keep them informed on the new findings of the new progress. So if there are known unknowns, I think the first task you should take in your project, preferably with a senior developer, is to removing those, right? Or to making those either known unknowns or known knowns. So whatever that means, right? Like if you know that, okay, this particular thing requires some security policy, then going creating a task to actually investigate that and clearly understanding what is expected, who all should be involved, what needs to be done, or in terms of, let's say, resources, like resource provisioning. I mean, not people, but the
Mm-hmm.
actual hardware, right? Like who, where do we request? Like, are there different teams to request, let's say, databases versus CPUs and whatnot? So clarifying all those things should be then your first task, because the more you can disambiguate earlier, the more clarity you will have in terms of what timelines are feasible, right? So that solves a set of problems. But still, during the actual implementation, you may discover something that you had not considered before, right? So in that case, the buffer helps. But as you said, like you can have some buffer, but it may not always be enough, right? So in that case, I think that's where the clear communication with stakeholders is important. Like if you can throughout, if you can tell them what you have been working on, what you have already disambiguated, and what is this new information, that gives them more confidence that you are not slacking off, right? You are actually doing something, and this was unavoidable. You did everything you could to make things as go as smooth as possible, but this is inevitable. So now something needs to be done, right? So in that case, like usually there are like three things, right? Like either you compromise on quality, or you add more people, or
Mm-hmm.
it's going to take more time, right? So it's like just like cap theorem, like you cannot have all three things at the same time. So you have to have this honest discussion with the PMs about, or whoever your counterpart, about what where do we have to cut corners, like can we afford to have more people? But it's not just that, like the work also needs to be parallelizable. Like
Mm-hmm.
like nine women cannot deliver
Yeah.
a baby in a month, right? It's the
Yeah.
same thing. So if something is parallelizable, then sure, adding, do you have other people that you can work on? Nobody's sitting free, or should not be sitting free, right? So if you're doing that, then what else is not getting delivered, right? Then making that clear to that stakeholder, because your stakeholders could be different, right? So in that
Mm-hmm.
case, you have to even like get everybody in the room who is impacted by that and clarify that, okay, this is why we have to move these people here. If you don't agree with this timeline, then you have to figure it out, or we have to escalate and whatnot. But clarifying that, you should not be blindsiding somebody saying that, hey, I had to pull this resource out, now your project is delayed, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's not fair. So that's for resourcing. Or if the timelines could be shifted, then that there are, in reality, there are very few projects which have like actual hard deadline, right? Like regulations or something. Like lawmakers are not going to bend backwards to accommodate you. They said, I want this by this date, that is it, right? But other timelines which are like internally driven, that, oh, we want to meet this customer demand by this quarter. Yes, ideally that is what you need to do, but it's not a hard and fast deadline, right? Unless
Mm-hmm.
your CEO going to fire you, that's a different story.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time people kind of understand that if it moves by a couple of weeks, not really that big of a deal. So if your project fits that situation, then that is definitely one card you can play. Or the third is the quality, right? Meaning that you may have some open bugs, and depending on the severity, like you have to understand what is okay to do, what is not okay to do. Like if there is a bug like three steps down the flow, and if the color is not what you're looking for, come on, I mean, that's not a
Mm-hmm.
P0, right? So in that case,
Yeah.
if you have that, or if you that click doesn't do anything, like, okay, not an ideal situation, but not like a something that has to be done by this date. You can do always fast follows. So you have to have discussions with your team, with your stakeholders, on what makes sense, what is possible, what is not possible, and and provide recommendation. Right, as a manager, it's your responsibility to own that. Right, like if something is not going your way, you cannot play victim card. Okay, we didn't anticipate that, but this is what we can do. This is my recommendation. I think that's how I would recommend people handling such situations.
Right. And you think like planning around the festival time is also something which is covered in the planning part, right? Availability of resources. You talked about hardware resources, but again, people resources are also very important.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry for not, and thank you for reminding me of that. When you estimate, like you have to understand. for what? Like as you said, festival is not going to move, right?
Mhm.
Diwali is not going to say, okay, like I'll come 2 days later. But you have to understand also people might be taking days off, right? You have to accommodate for unexpected sick time. You have to accommodate for, you are assuming that this person is working this day, but if half the day they are in meetings, that they're not really working full day. They are, I mean, working on this project for half day. Right, so you have to consider all these things in the estimation, and not just that. Okay, I'll do something, and then if there is a festival date, you have to start like as early as possible, work backwards from that, like assume that your real deadline is like again a month or two before that. uh, and for such festivals, things like load testing becomes super critical, right? Like, so again, like definition of done,
Yeah.
like am I testing for load, am I testing for latencies, all that thing need to be incorporated, and you have to start as early as possible and not be super optimistic about, or uh, being optimistic and positive is good, but maybe little pessimism in
Real.
this such cases is beneficial.
Yeah, and even in case, let's say a project is live, and once they are being used by the customers, there of course will face issues. Then it becomes a priority again, overcoming any other project that you must be working on, right? So it does take over.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of another important thing that you have to take into consideration. What you said, absolutely right. But even again, in estimation in terms of bandwidth, what is your current on-call load, right?
Mhm.
Because if your current team's 20% of time is going on handling on-call issues, then they are not available 100%, right? They are only available 80% of the time. So you have to incorporate that also. And then to your point about if, yeah, the customers are having issues, then you, even those you can prioritize, that what is a must, like what is a P0, what is, like if somebody cannot log in, obviously P0, right? But if only one person cannot log in, then it's not really a P0, right? Like, yes, you can provide some accommodation to that customers in a different way. But you have to again assess like what is, like, drop everything, fix this issue versus, okay, I'll get to it tomorrow, or okay, I'll get to it next week, kind of thing.
And one of the part of communication could also be about how sometimes priorities change in terms of an organization level discussion. Sometimes you're working on a project and it does get deprioritized. So you must need to communicate that with the team as well. And there are obviously difficult conversations because sometimes people are basing their promotions and their work is also going ahead in this. And then you have to tell them that, okay, this is not needed anymore at times in the organization. So how do you face that?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? And I don't think there is a good answer other than just being honest and honest about it, and acknowledging that this is a shitty situation, right? Like, uh, and people have put in a lot of hard work and you are disappointed, but you have to also explain why, right? As long as there is no trade secret behind that, like why this needs to be shut down, uh, you have, your team deserves an explanation of why this cannot be prioritized at this particular time. So usually it is either a significant direction change that you can explain that, hey, we thought this would be as impactful, but now we found this opportunity, which is going to be even more impactful. And we are betting all our money on that. So we have to kind of shift, right? So whatever the reason might be, I'm just making this example up right now. But being honest and acknowledging that this is not an ideal situation. You should not feel that, hey, they are being paid to do jobs, so it's either this or this, who cares, right? Please don't do that. Like as you said, like a lot of people are banking on specific projects for promotions and whatnot. But even that there, I mean, it could depend on the context. Like for example, specifically, at least in my observation, what I've seen, for junior folks to get to, let's say, mid-level, the impact of the project matters less, right? It's the impact on the project. So potentially you could still count what they have done, even though that project has not been kind of delivered to people. But if they actually solved a particular technical problem, and if some of the component could be reused for something else, you could reassure that, hey, we could still use this data point for your promotion, right? Or for your year-end evaluation. Again, be truthful. Don't make things up if that's not the case. And that is more relevant for junior folks. Like for senior folks, yeah, generally people expect that you actually have like delivered impact to either customers or to companies. But if there is still something that you could actually use for their end evaluation or for their promotion, then that could be reassuring to say that, hey, yeah, this is not ideal, but at least we could use these components or these parts. And yeah, but beyond that, like being, acknowledging the bad thing and being honest about the reasons, I personally don't know, and I think it is definitely a tough situation. And the company itself should do some retrospective, or the org to kind of make sure that this doesn't happen frequently, right? Otherwise, it's very demotivating, and that could result into people leaving the company.
Definitely. And let's say someone is actually now 4 or 5 years of experience and they are looking to transition into a managerial role. So what are the general trends that you see right now in the IT industry? Like what are the general trends in terms of a career path that people are seeing in, especially in managerial roles?
I mean, it so depends on, again, company. Like some, hold on. So you're asking specifically if they want to move to
Yeah.
management, right? Because management is one way of growing, but they could
Mhm.
grow in their own ladder
Definitely.
also. So uh, again, startups versus established companies can have different pros and cons and challenges. So if you're in a startup, like a manager may have a lot more responsibilities than big tech, especially because they may need to wear multiple hats. They may need to actually do coding. They need to also do people management, also do project management, and maybe even a little bit of product management. If that's what motivates you, then that could be one way. I think the toe of growing into startup is probably titles are a little more generous, right? You can be a director in 5 years. It's very difficult to become a director in 5 years in Amazon or Google. But then you can use that. Like if you have multiple people or multiple managers reporting to you, then even with, let's say, 5 or 6 years experience, you could use that to then get into big tech at a higher position, right? But then everything is going to have pros and cons. On the big tech side, like it is promotions. Once you become a manager, promotions become more and more difficult because a lot of time you need to give a justification of like business need. Why do we need this particular levels manager, right? So that could work either in favor of you or against you. Like if there is a significant gap and you can show that, hey, you have already performed those duties and you can fill that gap, then that's great, right? But if there are already multiple L7s in the org and the org cannot justify that, why we need another L7 manager, even though you are doing really well, you may not get to that level because there is no position for you over there. So these are like some kind of challenges. I think these situations have a little less kind of impact on the startups because they can make things up in, like, not in a bad way, but they
Mhm.
are more flexible in terms of like budget or levels and whatnot, right? So, but yeah, general trajectory is, so I think in big tech, like L5 is the entry level manager position. The you Typically you need to have some kind of data points to get that. Usually people show that the strong performers show that, okay, I want to get into management, and then they start with either having an intern to see how they are kind of managing an intern, or informally kind of have a couple of junior members reporting to them, so they may not get insights into their compensation and whatnot, but they are responsible for their delivering the project or providing feedback, managing communication, etc. So once you show that, you can say, okay, I have some data points, I think I could be a good manager. Then you transition into that role. It's possible, but it's rare that an IC from one company goes into another company as a manager. Like at least in big tech, you need to have some experience. But it's possible if that's what you want to do. You can create some data points to show why you're still kind of suitable for that job. And then once you are in that, like then L5, L6, L7, I think L5 to L6 is relatively easier in that, like, you don't have to justify the business need. Again, I'm just making like the levels up, right? Different companies will have
Mhm.
different things, but then beyond that, it kind of becomes progressively difficult because of the business need, and also the expectations are very high. Uh, some people are super driven, some people are not. So I think you don't. My recommendation would be, don't just chase titles. You understand the expectations from that role. Don't set yourself up for failure, right? Like being aggressive and being ambitious is good, but not at the expense of your mental health, physical health. So understand the trade-offs, understand what you need to do, and then you can progress appropriately.
Someone is asking like their 8 years experience and they're looking already a manager at the company and they're looking to join tier one companies like Google, Amazon, and all those. So what is it like? How should they prepare for it? What are the general probably interview tips or anything that you would want to convey with?
Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot give specific interview tips. Company policy does not allow me to
Yeah.
do that. But at a high level, like, understand this information you can find from recruiters, right? So I mean, I don't mind sharing that. Like, understand the loop structure. Like, they will have three components typically, like coding part, system design part, and behavioral part. So you will have to prepare for all those. Coding is a little tricky because I think it's if you don't do it, it's going to count against you. But if you do it well, it's not really going to help that much. So
Hmm.
the weightage to system design and behavioral is more for managers, but coding is like a checkbox. Like, oh no, you at least needed to
It
check
should.
that. But if you do that, but if you don't do well in others, like that doesn't work in your favor. But if you don't do well, that can work against you. So that is important. System design is very important. Behavioral is very important. From personal experience, I would say understand what level you are interviewing for. Is it L5? Is it L6? Is it L7? Understand what they are looking for that level. So because different companies interpret levels differently, right? And then try to see whether your experience, whatever data points you have, actually satisfy those needs, right? Because if they don't, then the challenge with behavioral answers is like there's no right or wrong answers, right? You are explaining your experience. But if they don't get the signals that they want, that hey, this person has demonstrated L6 level capabilities in their performance, then they're not gonna accept you, even though you feel that your answers are solid, right? So do that research, make sure that you understand the expectations from that role, and prepare. Like I would, some people are born geniuses. I would personally not recommend that. Like it never worked for me. Like studying last minute or either for the exam or for the interview. Take behavioral interviews very seriously. Prepare as much as you can. There is also balance. You have to don't burn yourself out, but don't be somebody who said, "Oh, I just appeared for this interview and cracked it." Okay, you can do it, great, but I think preparation never hurts. So have the right, understand the same thing requirements and prepare accordingly.
Yeah, it's always better when you are in an interview and it feels easy to you. So preparing always helps, definitely. And one last question, in the interest of time, is how is it's a question which is again asked in any of the streams that we do on GeeksforGeeks, especially that what are the general hiring trends now in 2025? What is it that we are looking forward to?
I don't know. I'm hopeful. I don't have any information that says like I haven't seen. I've heard anecdotally that okay, they're picking up, but there is no clear guidance as such, or even mandate that okay, we need to achieve these targets, etc. I'm personally hopeful that it will get a little better, mainly because as the interest rates, I'm talking about US. I unfortunately
Mhm.
don't know about India. As the interest rates come down, like companies will have little more budget, or they can borrow more cheaply, so they can afford to spend a little more and probably start taking a little more risks. So and also the skills, right? I think the LLMs are probably going to be like quite hot or even requirement in terms of opening door into a particular company. So if you are updating your skills, not everybody needs to learn LLM. Like I personally haven't done any this thing in that. My motivations are different, right? But you don't have to
Mhm.
follow me. See what is your motivation, what is your interest, and one thing that I can say though is it is good to know like where the trends are going to be. That either gives you some idea or gives you hope that okay things will get better. But don't wait for that to start preparing. Right? If you want to move, like you want to be prepared anytime, so that when you see things picking up, you want to immediately apply at that time. You don't have to then start preparing because by the time the role will already would have gotten filled. So uh, long that was a long answer to your question. The short answer is I don't know. I'm hopeful, but personally I haven't I've been getting interest from recruiters, but I've been getting that over the last 6 months anyways. I personally haven't seen a significant uptick in number of emails I receive, but there is definitely some like more recruiters have reached in past 3 months than let's say 3 months before.
Right. So we can be hopeful and we can always prepare for the right time to come rather than waiting for the time and then preparing is probably the gist of what we want to make sure that we are following. And thank you, Vineet, again for this session. We'll obviously we couldn't cover everything that we could also, but given in the interest of time, we also want to make sure that we are sticking to the target and then moving ahead in the next session, we'll cover the rest of the things. And of course, the questions probably we could also take up in more. Thank you again. Thank you for giving us time. And thank you everyone who joined in for this session. I hope it was useful and insightful for you. And we'll cover the rest of the things in the next session as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cool. Thanks, Shikhar. Yeah, it was great again chatting with you, and I had fun today as well. So looking forward to the next one too.
Definitely. Thanks.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.